that constantly keeps coming up in these conversations. Liability. Whose liability is it anyway?
Great. Thank you very much, John. Thank you to everybody for turning up. I look out the window here and I'm reminded of my last trip to Washington, D.C., when apparently everybody descends on D.C. about this time of year to see the cherry blossoms. And I think there are more cherry blossoms out this window than I saw in the entirety of Washington, D.C. So you don't need to travel quite so far. I wanted to dive straight into the heart of the big debate at the moment in age verification, but try and do so as a sort of a gentle introduction for those of you who may be completely new to the question. So apologies to anybody who's deeply technical, because this is not going to be a deeply technical talk, which is helpful as my degree was in politics, not anything to do with technology. So we're going to look at liability, frankly, and the basic questions in age assurance, as I understand them, are who decides what children can access, who then enforces those decisions, and who's accountable if something goes wrong. And those are obviously not technical questions, but they're questions around accountability. And I am a broken record on this. I've always said that this, the outcome of these debates is going to be decided on one thing and one thing only, and that is the question of liability. So who is at fault if something goes wrong? There has been a sea change, frankly. I was with the State Department in the US on my trip to DC, and I'd been to see them about 9 months previously, and they thought this weird age verification thing was some conspiracy by the rest of the world to hobble Silicon Valley and great American tech companies. Huge change in their perspective now. They are thinking about this much more as an issue that is preoccupying US states. We know half of the US states now have age verification requirements for adult content. And there are literally hundreds of bills before them now covering everything from children's data to chatbot AI to social media. It's really come very, very fast into the US. And of course, whether you like it or not, that is the center of the technical universe. So really how the debate plays out there is going to be critical everywhere else. So the question is no longer should we do it or will it happen, but how will it be done? And I think, as I say, the real question is who's going to carry the responsibility. There are four main options on the table as to who we put in charge of this: parents, publishers, so websites and apps themselves, app stores. You may have heard of something called the App Store Accountability Act, which is being widely proposed across the US, and sort of a variation on a theme, the operating system itself. So I just thought we'd go through each of those in turn. But effectively, that's a bad way to start that one. I'm going to say that what we're comparing is how effective are these options, and do they align accountability appropriately? So if we want to, if we start with parents, then the accountability is pretty good, but it's not particularly effective. We spent the last 20 years relying on parents to implement controls, and that's what got us to where we are today. With the App Store, it's great for controlling the distribution, but it doesn't actually control your actual exposure to risk once you're within an app. An app can have a multitude of different functionality and content, some of which might be perfectly safe for children, other which might be horrendous for children. Operating systems, very good, strong place to put the control, but weak accountability because it's not the operating systems who've got anything to do with the app or the website that you're accessing. And then, if you come to the one which obviously declaring my interest as the executive director of the Age Verification Providers Association, where you ask the publisher to take responsibility, then we believe you're aligning risk with legal liability appropriately. But just to be fair to all the different options, I'll go through in a bit more detail. So, parental controls, this is where you and I'm sure those of you who are parents have got quite used to this. You're trying to figure out how to put some controls on your router, some on the device, getting into each of the different games that your kids might be playing, setting them up appropriately for your kids. It responds well to parental authority. Whenever I fly to the US, I have to change gear in my head and think, right, they're really big on parents' rights over there, in a way that many other places around the world just rely more on government to make these decisions. In the US, it's very much down to parents. And you can set up very, very detailed controls for each of the different games or applications that your kids are accessing. So it's very bespoke. But there are some limitations. It's complex. It relies on parents who've got the time and the knowledge and the capability, and frankly, the application to set up these controls. They are vulnerable to workarounds by smart kids. I think most parents fairly quickly come to realize their children know more about technology than they do. And I said earlier that we've had 20 years of trying it this way, and I don't believe it's worked. And it fails at scale because it's reliant on that parental behavior rather than any issue with the system itself. I think those parental control systems are probably quite good. Another point to make is it may infringe children's rights because you are, and most countries in the world except the US have signed up to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and part of that would be the right to access information, the right to make contacts and to form friendships. And if right the way up to the age of 18 your parents are dictating everything you can and cannot do online, that's not well aligned to the UN Convention. So the policy there is it shifts the responsibility away from those who actually control the experience online to those with the least control, in other words, to the parents. In the publisher model, where we have checks at the point of access, we think this aligns the control with the liability. It also puts the control closest to the risk, and I'll talk in a second about something called the proximity principle. And also, there's a really strong track record of doing it this way. We've been doing it in gambling for many years, not least thanks to John Carr here, who campaigned tirelessly for preventing kids gambling online. I think that's where you got into this business. And obviously, selling alcohol and so on. And then more recently, we saw, particularly in the UK last summer, a very successful implementation of age checks by the publishers for adult content. And this, I think, is the only model where the liability, the control, and the risk are all co-located in the same place. But historically, there have been concerns about cost, and certainly when I started in this business 7 years ago now, people were regularly thinking of charging 50 cents, $1. Some of the big US ID providers thought they would be charging $1.50 or $2. I think that's what they told their investors as well. And we're now looking at costs which have come down even in the current market to a number of cents per check, particularly when you get into high volumes, and could fall even further with reusable checks and interoperability. So I suspect that won't be quite such a problem. This approach is sort of vested in the concept of product liability, and I think it may be one of the reasons that platforms are now at least engaging in these conversations a lot more than they were. You will probably have noticed a very large fine for one of the major platforms in New Mexico and another one in California quite recently, all related to their inability or failure to do age checks. And I think economically this is aligning things correctly. So I mentioned liability and control, but also the cost of compliance is paid for by those who profit from it. And the people who are doing the risk management actually understand the risk of their product, because the only person who can really see inside that experience, apart from the user themselves, is the person delivering it. This is the classic approach, and it's also, frankly, how we've regulated risk in other, real-world industries since time immemorial. That also means regulators have a better understanding of how to enforce it. Just to come back to the proximity principle, this we borrow from real world health and safety. And essentially it says, you put your warning sign about the big hole on your building site as close as possible to the big hole as possible, because then people are less likely to walk past it and miss it. And so in an online world, when we're saying if you put the age check right where the content or the functionality is, then it doesn't matter which device you're accessing it with, whether you're using some sort of VPN or whatever mechanism you're using to get to it, you're still going to hit that control when you get there. Model number 3 is the App Store approach. And this is billed as a way to control what minors can actually download. It's a great central control point. There are only really 2 major app stores that we'd have to worry about. Obviously, it doesn't at the moment control websites. I think, to be fair, it could be extended into having some control over websites if browsers were able to pick up on that signal. But you can also obviously get a lot of content without using an app. Most of our AI use at the moment is just going straight to a website, for example. And it's designed to control the distribution rather than very more specifically about the harm. It does empower parents on what they can download. The theory is that kids shouldn't be signing terms and conditions. They're not legally old enough to do so in many jurisdictions. But I think that was mostly invented in the US because there are these strong First Amendment constitutional protections, where if you do anything that looks like it's a content-based piece of law, you will fail in the courts. And we've seen a lot of bills fail in the courts around social media in particular. And the App Store Accountability Act itself is also struggling in some courts, but there's been some progress at the appellate stage in the US, where judges are beginning to look a bit more broadly than simply writing it off as a poorly disguised content limitation. It can, of course, still be circumvented with using jailbreaking. There's always the issue of shared and handed down devices. And of course, increasingly, we know that kids are getting a second phone, a burner device, as it were. And it is a very binary thing. It's, do I get the app or do I not get the app? So, a complex app with lots of different functionality, you may end up having to stop kids accessing it at all, even if there's some useful stuff within there. And finally, the operating system side of things. So this is the age signals at the device level, probably when you set it up originally. It's emerging in policy debates we see around the world. It's obviously a very strong technical control. Again, a single place to implement the control. Those same limitations I mentioned in the previous model are also apply here. But there are two sort of ways of doing this as well. There is a parental control, effectively, where the parents put in the age, or you can require an independent age assurance of whatever age signal is being set at the time. In fact, I was talking to NBC News in the US yesterday, just updating my phone as I went, and literally as it updated to iOS 26, it demanded that I proved I was over 18, which I thought was rather apposite. So Apple is doing that on their device, but they're only keeping that information to themselves. They also offer the App Store solution, but they only want to share that information with people who have a need to know, rather than sort of broadcasting your age range to anyone. And Google are offering the ability to transmit an age from an age credential that somebody else provides, not that Google provides, to third parties as well out of your wallet. These do primarily target Google and Apple. They forgot to write that in the legislation. By the way, the American state legislation process is crazy. In one state, they wrote to me on one day with 2 paragraphs for a law they were thinking of, and 3 weeks later, it was a full-blown, fully implemented law in that particular state. So not much time for scrutiny. And with this particular bill, they kind of forgot the Linuxes of this world, all the open source operating systems who were like, well, hang on, how are we supposed to do that? So just to recap, we've got the parents, the publishers, the app stores, and the operating systems. And that is really the great debate in public policy. We prefer the publisher model, but we can now offer a sort of augmented version of that, which is interoperability, which does allow you to do one check and then use it across multiple sites. It's also got the anonymity that you'll hear about, what we call double blind, the impossibility for the website to find the user's identity, or for the age verification providers or that interoperability system to know which websites the user is visiting. And it keeps control, as we said before, on the proximity principle, close to the risk. So the policy question is not a technical debate, it's a governance thing. Do we want it sort of as a platform-centric thing where you have upstream control at the device level or in the App Store, or do we put it more towards the service where we think that's more aligned with liability? And it's still a question of accountability. Now, we're not starting from scratch. We've got standards, and there'll be plenty of discussion of standards at this conference, IEEE 2089.1, and you can come to a very exciting discussion about how to amend Annex A, which I'm leading this afternoon, of that, which sets some standardized levels of assurance. 27566, which Tony, who spoke before me, did an epic job of producing version, -1 of that, -2 and -3 are in progress. And we can also work with IAB, W3C, and regulators, who are all very involved in this around the world. There's a global age assurance regulators forum, for example, that the ICO runs. The state of the debate right now is, it was lovely a couple of years ago. I'd show up on my own to state legislatures and give my evidence, and they'd listen and ask some questions. Now when I go, it's a crowded room because big tech send their lobbyists. And of course, the politicians know nothing really about this technology. It is new. We shouldn't expect them to. Most of their advisors are lawyers. They probably know less about it than the politicians. So it leaves the political process almost entirely at the whim of the lobbyists. And it means, in essence, who's got the deepest pockets may well win the debate. And I don't think that's the right way to form good public policy. Obviously, some countries have better restrictions on how much money you can throw around than others. When I was with the State Department, and they are now beginning to engage globally, what they said was they'd like to start with principles. And I think there is a sort of consensus now around the sort of principles we're trying to achieve: anonymity, clear liability, proportionality, measurable effectiveness, and I hope we will this year at least get interoperability added, and many regulators, to their credit, do cite interoperability. This is more for those who want to look at the slides afterwards and go through in detail. But one really interesting thing that I just stumbled across because of my newsfeed. By the way, my Google Alerts used to give me 2 or 3 news articles a day a few years ago. Now it's sort of 200 or 300 on this topic. So it's hard to make sure you don't miss anything. But one American commentator, he's called Rob Braxman, pointed out an issue with these operating system and app store based models, which is you may have shifted the control and the power in doing this, but without really realizing it, because part of reading something that's stored on the device is checking that is a legitimate thing and it hasn't been spoofed. And the way that's done is by interacting with what you might think of as a secure enclave in your device, which is where all the really, really secret stuff is kept. And that's the bit that gives third parties confidence that what they're being told is legit. And however, in doing so, you are connecting every third party that user is going to with the owner of that operating system. So we may inadvertently be giving Google and Apple a lot more information about what the user is doing. We're still preserving the anonymity on the other side. I need to thank Phil from Lucidity for this new concept. We may need to move from double blind to triple blind, where we make sure that also the operating system is not able to track what a user's doing when they are, by virtue of age assurance. So what's the best way forward? Start with those principles, add on the international standards. We do try and work with the international bodies. There's a lot of them involved in this. Some of them came a bit late to the party, but they're very welcome. A lot of education is required with policymakers in particular. Just to seal it all off, we're very much in favour of audit and certification. By the start of next year, we're going to require all of our full members to be certified to the relevant international standards in the trade association, just to make it really clear what how much we prioritise quality rather. So these goals are all achievable, but not all of them are achieved under every single architecture. And it is therefore a really critical question as we go forward about what architecture is going to win. So if something goes wrong, who is responsible? That should determine where the age assurance sits, and liability should flow with that. So hopefully we'll get to a point where we've got frictionless, low cost, proportionate, effective, truly anonymous age verification. And the risk here is not just failing to do age verification, but it's locking ourselves into the wrong architecture with perhaps some unintended consequences, or consequences that only a few people are looking at. And I'll just conclude with the lesson of Betamax. When this came out up against VHS, anybody technical knew it was a much better system, but in the end, it was VHS that won. And what I would like us to do ideally is to skip the whole VHS Betamax debate, skip the Blu-ray debate, move all the way to where we are now, where we sort of download things on demand. So get to the end state as quickly as possible in a way that's aligned around the world, so we don't waste a lot of time going down the wrong path. So I'm very happy to take a couple of questions if there are any, but that concludes it. Thank you.
Are there any? Thanks very much, Iain. There are no questions coming via the online route, but if anybody in the room wants to raise anything or ask something, please do. Could you just tell us who you are and where you're from?
I'm Chris Warren from Kids Web Services / Epic Games. So I have a concern about I have a concern about going down the wrong path with operating level age assurance. I think it's a valid approach, but I think the implementations by Apple and Google have been rushed out without proper thought. For example, my main concern is there's no cryptographic provenance of the verification itself. So you call a client-side API to get the signals from the operating system. But if you've got a jailbroken device, that can be spoofed. And you also have to get that signal from the operating system back to your backend without it being intercepted, which is something traditional kind of server-based communications avoids. So I'm worried in particular because legislation is starting to kind of mandate operating system level verification. But if that is built upon shonky bedrock of a poor implementation, I think we're going down the wrong path.
Thank you. I'm not even going to attempt to jump into the technology because I'm not qualified to do so. But I think what you say kind of hopefully reflects and echoes what the kind of points I was trying to make there, that politicians don't know what they're doing, and we are moving. I'm not thinking about the consequences and some of those really detailed technical issues.
Won't it be, pardon me for jumping in, won't it be in part down to bodies like the ICO to ensure that questions of the kind that you've just raised are properly addressed? It's a privacy question as much as anything else. It's about what's happening to the data, the personal data, and that's a technical matter as much as it's a political question.
Yeah, and I think one place where we in the UK or Australia and to some extent the EU are better off than the US is that our regulators, often have very good technical people working within them. I see one sitting at the back of the room, they provide input to that policy development process, and we definitely don't spend 3 weeks writing the Online Safety Act. I think we took about 7 years.
Much more than 7 years, but yeah, definitely. I mean, Pornhub sent one of their senior executives over to the UK about a year ago, was it? Perhaps a bit more, arguing, trying to lobby government and Ofcom in favour only of the operating system as being the only way of doing it. I won't say that naturally predisposed me to be against it, because I'm a rational, reasonable human being, and we ought to consider every point of view. But that there are definitely certain interests who are very strongly backing that idea. And why? For the reasons Iain gave. It removes liability from the people who are actually publishing the stuff and making the stuff available in the first place.
Rob.
Yeah.
There's a microphone.
Say who you are and so on.
So I'm Rob Cotlance at OneID. I follow Iain. My panels or my session's the next one. Iain, you talked a little bit about the fines, and you've talked a little bit about the issues, a lot of in detail, and I'm actually going to reinforce many of the things you've said in some practical examples in a short while. Reddit have just had a £14 million fine from the ICO, and you referenced a number of others. Discord have had 70,000 records stolen in Australia, and the Australian regulator is fuming. We've got, you mentioned the adult industry and online safety. There have been several fines of £1 million. That's not an insignificant sum of money. OnlyFans, under previous regulation, have already been fined £1 million. So this doesn't look great. It really doesn't. Some of the biggest companies are getting fines, and these are quite recent fines that are subject to this regulation. Why do you think that's happening?
I think some degree of low awareness. I think there's now this new sort of concept of malicious compliance. So people are sort of going along a little bit with compliance, but knowing that they're not really wanting to see it succeed. So in Australia, the maximum fine is 49.5 million Australian dollars, not far off the same figure in US dollars. That's nothing to these big platforms. And the last thing they want is the Australian social media law to be seen as being successfully implemented. So I think they would quite happily write off a few $50 million fines in the global world. And a $50 million fine in one financial year is actually not even going to affect your share price. that doesn't really, unless people believe it's going to be a recurring cost every year, that might begin to dent your share price. But otherwise, this is just potentially the cost of doing business to some people. It's been great Australia's led on this, but I think we're going to need to see some concerted efforts around the world so that the platforms, when they do that business case of should we comply or should we not, because sadly, compliance these days is a business case. It's not that's the law, I should follow it. It's what's it going to cost me to follow it, or what's it going to cost me not to follow it. And you've got to tilt that balance before people start to come into compliance.
I'll add a sub-question then. Do you think that there is enough level of enforcement by regulators and governments in different economies around the world in order to encourage compliance?
I will say no, because I think that's our role as a trade association, is to be biting at the heels of the regulators to say, please enforce more. And by the way, we also say, please also enforce on us more. We want to be more regulated as an industry in order to be trusted. So it's not like we're trying to just push them off and go after others. But also I understand why they are a little bit careful about this. Those platforms also have very, very deep pockets, and even government regulators don't have the same access to legal services and the costs as others do.
Thank you.
I was at a briefing yesterday in the House of Lords in London with Matthew Bergman, who was the victim's lawyer in the case in the California courts that was reported about 2 weeks ago. And a lot of people missed. It was the headline early on was a $3 million award to AKG, who was the victim in this case. Actually, it was $6 million. $3 million directly to AKG as nominally compensation for the harm suffered by the neglect or the activity of, in that case, Meta and Google. But $3 million were punitive damages. And I looked, I was a lawyer originally, many moons ago, academic lawyer, by the way, rather than a professional one. But the rules under the California statutes about award of punitive damages are very clear. For a jury to be able to award punitive damages, they have to be convinced of malice and intent to harm people. And that's what they found in that case, that they were willfully, as it were, aware of the risks to children and the harm that it could be done. And they also accepted, by the way, that the companies knew that they were children, right? They weren't verifying it in any of the ways that we've been describing, but they had the information and the data. And because they failed to act upon that knowledge to protect the child, they were given $3 million in punitive damages. Now, that could vary. There will be appeals, and this is not, it could be 2 or 3 years before all of this is resolved in the American courts, and nobody can say for sure how it will end up. And there was the case the previous day, by coincidence, in New Mexico, where I think Iain was involved, where they were given, it wasn't a criminal case, it was a civil case, but $375 million of penalties for 50,000. I think it was $5,000 per individual breach that the judge calculated was involved in the trial. And that's how he got to this figure of $375 million in fines. So, around the world, the legislators and the regulators are still learning, still getting to grips with all of this. And who would have thought that the American courts might be a source of hope when so much else? Anyway, no, I'm going to stop at that point. I'm not going to complete that sentence. Iain, I know you've been involved in the New Mexico case.
We wouldn't be involved in. We try not to take a policy perspective and try not to get involved in that. I think we would be involved in advising courts about remedies and what these platforms need to now do to stop this happening again. I think that's an appropriate thing for us to do.
Okay.